Just hours before Donald Trump was set to walk into one of the most important NATO summits in years, Vladimir Putin sent a message that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with pure, calculated intimidation. Because in the early hours of Monday morning, ballistic missiles and drones tore through the Ukrainian capital, killing at least 12 people inside the city itself and 6 more in the surrounding region, with dozens wounded and families pulled from the rubble of their own apartment buildings. And if you think this timing was a coincidence, you have not been paying attention to how Putin operates, because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had already warned the world just hours earlier that Moscow was preparing a new massive strike. And once the missiles actually landed, Zelensky said something that cuts right to the heart of what is really happening here. He called it typical of Putin, striking right after America's Independence Day and right before the NATO summit in Ankara. And once you understand the full picture surrounding this attack, you will realize this was not random violence. This was a message aimed directly at Trump, at NATO, and at every Western leader about to sit down at the same table this week. Let's walk through exactly what happened on the ground first, because the scale of this attack tells its own story. Massive explosions lit up the night sky over Kyiv as ballistic missiles and drones hammered multiple districts of the city at once. Residential buildings were badly damaged. An entire family was killed and pulled from the rubble of one apartment block, and cars were seen burning in the streets as rescuers scrambled to evacuate residents, including children, from the upper floors of damaged buildings. Kyiv's mayor described destruction and damage across 4 separate districts of the city, with one district in particular taking the hardest hit. Meanwhile, in the surrounding region outside the capital, 6 more people were killed as the same wave of strikes spread beyond the city limits. This attack did not come out of nowhere either. It came just days after an even deadlier assault on Kyiv that killed 30 people, making it the 3rd deadliest attack on the capital since this war began. And the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has now confirmed that civilian casualties throughout this year are significantly higher than during the same period last year, which tells you that this war, rather than winding down towards some kind of resolution, is actually intensifying against civilian targets specifically. Now, here is where the timing becomes impossible to ignore. This latest strike landed on the eve of a critical NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, one of the most consequential gatherings the alliance has held in years, with President Trump himself scheduled to attend. And in a moment that will likely be replayed and dissected for weeks, Trump had spoken directly with Putin just one day earlier, engaging in a phone call lasting nearly 90 minutes, according to Russia's own foreign ministry, during which Trump once again offered to help end the war. Think about that sequence of events for a moment. A full 90-minute conversation between the American president and the Russian president framed around ending the bloodshed, and less than 24 hours later, missiles are falling on residential apartment buildings in Kyiv. If you were trying to send a message that diplomacy means nothing to you unless it happens entirely on your terms, this is exactly how you would do it. And this is not the first time Trump's promises on this war have collided head-on with reality. When Trump returned to office for his 2nd term, he vowed to solve this war within 24 hours of taking power, a bold, sweeping promise that generated headlines around the world. But we are now more than 500 days into his current term, and despite multiple attempts, multiple phone calls, multiple diplomatic overtures, his administration has yet to find any real path toward peace between these 2 neighboring countries. Every single time it looks like momentum might be building toward a ceasefire or a serious negotiation, something happens on the battlefield that resets the entire conversation back to zero. And this latest strike on Kyiv is just the newest example of that pattern repeating itself right before the world's attention turns to Ankara. So why Ankara specifically, and why now? Let's break down exactly what is happening at this NATO summit, because understanding the stakes here is exactly what explains why Putin chose this particular moment to strike. This is the 36th NATO summit in the alliance's history, and only the 2nd time Turkey has hosted one, the first being back in 2004 in Istanbul. Heads of state and government from all 32 NATO member countries are gathering in Ankara for 2 full days of high-stakes discussions. And according to NATO's own Secretary General, the summit is built around 3 central priorities: increasing allied defense investment, strengthening transatlantic defense industrial production, and continuing support for Ukraine. Zelensky himself is expected to be there, attending an official dinner hosted by the Turkish president, delivering a speech at the Defense Industry Forum, and taking part in a NATO-Ukraine Council meeting alongside allied leaders. NATO members are also expected to pledge 70 billion euros in military assistance for Ukraine for this year alone, with a commitment to maintain at least equivalent levels of support into next year. And the summit's declaration is expected to explicitly describe Russia as a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security and stability. Now, here's the part that makes Putin's timing even more calculated. This summit is happening during a period of real strain inside the alliance itself. Trump has spent months publicly pressuring European allies to dramatically increase their own defense spending and take on far greater responsibility for their own continent's security, and his rhetoric toward NATO has at times been openly critical, even dismissive, raising real questions among some member states about whether Washington's long-term commitment to the alliance can still be counted on. Some NATO and European officials have gone as far as expressing concern that recent American military operations elsewhere in the world could create procurement delays that end up directly affecting weapons deliveries to Ukraine. In other words, right at the exact moment when unity and resolve are supposed to be on full display in Ankara, there are already visible cracks in how committed everyone actually is to that unity, and Putin knows this. A well-timed, brutal strike on Kyiv right before this exact gathering does more than just kill and terrorize civilians. It tests whether the alliance will actually respond with the kind of unified, forceful language its own summit declaration is supposed to represent, or whether the attack simply gets absorbed into the news cycle as one more grim data point in a war that much of the world has started to treat as background noise. And here's what makes this even more infuriating if you look at why Ukraine could not stop these missiles from hitting their targets. Zelensky has been renewing his plea to allies for additional missiles, specifically for Patriot air defense systems. And according to his own statement, the reason Ukraine was unable to shoot down any ballistic missiles during Monday's assault came down to an insufficient supply of interceptor missiles. Read that again. Ukraine physically did not have enough interceptors on hand to knock these missiles out of the sky before they hit apartment buildings full of civilians. Zelensky is now using this exact moment, this exact tragedy, to make his most urgent case yet to the world, and especially to the United States and European partners, that they need to leave the NATO summit in Ankara with real, concrete, strong decisions in support of strengthening Ukraine's air defenses, not vague statements, not another round of ironclad commitment language, but actual missiles that can actually stop the next wave of strikes before they land. Meanwhile, on the ground in eastern Ukraine, Russian forces have been stepping up their push to capture more of the Donetsk region, which remains one of the Kremlin's key long-term objectives in this entire war. And Ukraine's cities continue facing near nightly bombardment from Russian drones and missiles as a matter of routine rather than exception. But it is worth noting that Ukraine has not simply been absorbing these attacks passively. In fact, Ukraine has ramped up its own missile and drone campaign deep inside Russian territory, specifically targeting oil refineries, ports, and military production facilities that keep Russia's war machine funded and supplied. On the same overnight period as the Kyiv strikes, Russian state media reported that Russia shot down more than 500 Ukrainian drones launched toward Russian territory, which tells you this is very much a two-way exchange of devastating strikes rather than a one-sided campaign. Both sides are now targeting each other's ability to sustain the war itself, not just frontline positions. Let's talk about why Putin might be feeling pressure to project strength through exactly this kind of dramatic, well-timed strike right now. Because behind the scenes, Russia's own battlefield performance has been struggling in ways that rarely make it into Kremlin messaging. Independent reporting has documented that Russia's advance has nearly stalled out entirely in certain sectors this year, and there are now growing numbers of Russian soldiers actively requesting help to desert the war altogether, according to groups that specialize in helping Russian soldiers flee. One activist working with such a group has directly stated that the longer Russia's advance stalls, the higher the number of soldiers looking for a way out becomes. Put simply, the same battlefield stagnation we've discussed before in previous coverage continues to be a very real problem for the Kremlin, and a high-profile headline-grabbing strike on Kyiv's civilian districts, timed perfectly to coincide with a major Western summit, gives Putin exactly the kind of dominant, unshakable image he desperately needs to project to both his own population and to the watching world, even while his actual military campaign continues grinding forward at a painfully slow pace. This is also worth connecting to the broader economic strain we've talked about before, because Crimea continues facing fuel rationing and rolling power disruptions as Ukraine's long-range strike campaign keeps hammering Russian logistics and energy infrastructure. Every one of these pressures, the stalled advance, the rising desertions, the economic strain inside occupied territories, adds up to a Kremlin that has every incentive to manufacture dramatic, visible displays of aggression precisely when the world's cameras are pointed elsewhere, like a NATO summit in Ankara. Because a single devastating strike on a capital city generates far more headlines and far more perceived strength than months of incremental, unglamorous territorial grinding ever could. So what does all of this actually mean heading into the summit itself? It means Trump arrives in Ankara facing an incredibly awkward, difficult optical problem. He spent nearly 90 minutes on the phone with the man who, less than a day later, authorized a missile strike that killed civilians in their own homes. Whatever assurances were exchanged during that call, whatever diplomatic language was used, the reality on the ground in Kyiv makes it painfully clear that Putin is not treating these conversations as any kind of meaningful step toward peace. If Trump wants to walk away from Ankara having demonstrated real strength and real progress toward ending this war, this attack has just made that far more difficult, because now every reporter, every allied leader, every skeptic of continued American engagement in NATO has a fresh, brutal example of exactly how little these phone calls seem to actually accomplish. It also puts enormous pressure on the language that comes out of the summit's final declaration. NATO's own draft communications have already described Russia as a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security, but the real test now is whether that language gets backed up with anything concrete, faster delivery of Patriot interceptors, stronger sanctions enforcement, a unified statement condemning this specific strike by name, or whether it once again settles into the kind of carefully worded, diplomatically safe phrasing that changes nothing about the reality Ukrainian civilians are living through night after night. Zelensky's own plea heading into this summit could not be clearer. He wants concrete decisions, not just more expressions of solidarity that sound reassuring in a press release, but do nothing to stop the next ballistic missile from reaching an apartment building in Kyiv. And here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Wars like this one are shaped as much by symbolism and timing as they are by battlefield maps and casualty counts. Putin understands, probably better than most Western leaders want to admit, that a well-timed strike carries enormous psychological weight. It dominates headlines right as global attention turns toward a summit meant to project unity and strength. It forces uncomfortable questions about whether diplomatic engagement with Russia produces anything beyond photo opportunities. And it reminds every leader gathering in Ankara that no matter what gets said inside that summit hall, the war outside continues on Putin's terms, at a time and place of his choosing, regardless of what promises were made on a phone call the night before. None of this guarantees what happens next. NATO could respond to this attack with genuinely strengthened commitments, faster weapons deliveries, and unified political pressure that actually shifts Putin's calculations. Or the summit could produce exactly the kind of carefully worded but ultimately toothless statement that critics have warned about for years, allowing this attack to fade from headlines within days while the underlying pattern, stalled diplomacy followed by devastating strikes, simply repeats itself again. At the next moment, global attention shifts toward Russia and Ukraine. What we do know is that the timing of this strike was not accidental. It was a calculated message sent directly into a moment when the world's most powerful military alliance was about to gather and talk about supporting Ukraine. And that message was simple and brutal. No phone call, no summit, and no declaration changes what is happening on the ground unless it comes with real consequences attached. So here's what I want to know from you watching this right now. Do you think Trump and NATO will actually respond to this attack with real consequences at the Ankara summit? Or do you think this strike will get absorbed into the news cycle with nothing but strong words to show for it? Drop your take in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of every major development from this NATO summit and this war as it unfolds, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next update.